Section 21 of Further Chronicles of Avonlea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Further Chronicles of Avonlea by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 11. The Education of Betty, Part 1. When Sarah Curry married Jack Churchill, I was broken-hearted, or believed myself to be so, which in a boy of 22 amounts to pretty much the same thing. Not that I took the world into my confidence, that was never the Douglas way, and I held myself in honor bound to live up to the family traditions. I thought then that nobody but Sarah knew, but I dare say now that Jack knew it also, for I don't think Sarah could have helped telling him. If he did know, however, he did not let me see that he did, and never insulted me by any implied sympathy. On the contrary, he asked me to be his best man. Jack was always a thoroughbred. I was best man. Jack and I had always been bosom friends, and although I had lost my sweetheart, I did not intend to lose my friend into the bargain. Sarah had made a wise choice, for Jack was twice the man I was. He had to work for his living, which perhaps accounts for it. So I danced at Sarah's wedding as if my heart were as light as my heels. But after she and Jack had settled down at Glenby, I closed the maples and went abroad, being, as I have hinted, one of those unfortunate mortals who need consult nothing but their own whims in the matter of time and money. I stayed away for 10 years, during which the Maples was given over to moths and rust, while I enjoyed life elsewhere. I did enjoy it hugely, but always under protest, for I felt that a broken-hearted man ought not to enjoy himself as I did. It jarred on my sense of fitness, and I tried to moderate my zest, and think more of the past than I did. It was no use. The present insisted on being intrusive and pleasant. As for the future, well, there was no future. Then Jack Churchill, poor fellow, died. A year after his death, I went home and again asked Sarah to marry me, as in duty bound. Sarah again declined, alleging that her heart was buried in Jack's grave, or words to that effect. I found that it did not much matter. Of course, at 32 one does not take these things to heart as at 22. I had enough to occupy me in getting the Maples into working order, and beginning to educate Betty. Betty was Sarah's 10-year-old daughter, and she had been thoroughly spoiled. That is to say, she had been allowed her own way in everything, and, having inherited her father's outdoor tastes, had simply run wild. She was a thorough tomboy, a thin, scrawny little thing with a trace of Sarah's beauty. Betty took after her father's dark, tall race, and, on the occasion of my first introduction to her, seemed to be all legs and neck. There were points about her, though, which I considered promising. She had fine, almond-shaped hazel eyes, the smallest and most shapely hands and feet I ever saw, and 2 enormous braids of thick nut-brown hair. For Jack's sake, I decided to bring his daughter up properly. Sarah couldn't do it, and didn't try. I saw that, if somebody didn't take Betty in hand, wisely and firmly, she would certainly be ruined. There seemed to be nobody except myself at all interested in the matter, so I determined to see what an old bachelor could do as regards bringing up a girl in the way she should go. I might have been her father. As it was, her father had been my best friend. Who had a better right to watch over his daughter? I determined to be a father to Betty, and do all for her that the most devoted parent could do. It was, self-evidently, my duty. I told Sarah I was going to take Betty in hand. Sarah sighed one of the plaintive little sighs which I had once thought so charming, but now to my surprise found faintly irritating, and said that she would be very much obliged if I would. "I feel that I am not able to cope with the problem of Betty's education, Stephen," she admitted. "Betty is a strange child, all Churchill. Her poor father indulged her in everything, and she has a will of her own, I assure you. I have really no control over her whatever. She does as she pleases, and is ruining her complexion by running and galloping out of doors the whole time. Not that she had much complexion to start with. The Churchills never had, you know." Sarah cast a complacent glance at her delicately tinted reflection in the mirror. "I tried to make Betty wear a sunbonnet this summer, but I might as well have talked to the wind." A vision of Betty in a sunbonnet presented itself to my mind, and afforded me so much amusement that I was grateful to Sarah for having furnished it. I rewarded her with a compliment. "It is to be regretted that Betty has not inherited her mother's charming colour," I said, "but we must do the best we can for her under her limitations. She may have improved vastly by the time she is grown up. And at least we must make a lady of her. She is a most alarming tomboy at present, but there is good material to work upon. There must be in the Churchill and Curry blend. But even the best material may be spoiled by unwise handling. I think I can promise you that I will not spoil it. I feel that Betty is my vocation, and I shall set myself up as a rival of Wordsworth's nature, of whose methods I have always had a decided distrust, in spite of his insidious verses." Sarah did not understand me in the least, but then she did not pretend to. "I confide Betty's education entirely to you, Stephen," she said, with another plaintive sigh. "I feel sure I could not put it into better hands. You have always been a person who could be thoroughly depended upon." Well, that was something by way of regard for a lifelong devotion. I felt that I was satisfied with my position as unofficial adviser-in-chief to Sarah and self-appointed guardian of Betty. I also felt that, for the furtherance of the cause I had taken to heart, it was a good thing that Sarah had again refused to marry me. I had a sixth sense which informed me that a staid old family friend might succeed with Betty where a stepfather would have signally failed. Betty's loyalty to her father's memory was passionate and vehement. She would view his supplanter with a resentment and distrust, but his old familiar comrade was a person to be taken to her heart. Fortunately for the success of my enterprise, Betty liked me. She told me this with the same engaging candour she would have used in informing me that she hated me, if she had happened to take a bias in that direction, saying frankly, "You are one of the very nicest old folks I know, Stephen. Yes, you are a ripping good fellow." This made my task comparatively easy one. I sometimes shudder to think what it might have been if Betty had not thought I was a ripping good fellow. I should have stuck to it, because that is my way, but Betty would have made my life a misery to me. She had startling capacities for tormenting people when she chose to exert them. I certainly should not have liked to be numbered among Betty's foes. I rode over to Glenby the next morning after my paternal interview with Sarah, intending to have a frank talk with Betty and lay the foundations of a good understanding on both sides. Betty was a sharp child, with a disconcerting knack of seeing straight through grindstones. She would certainly perceive and probably resent any underhanded management. I thought it best to tell her plainly that I was going to look after her. When, however, I encountered Betty, tearing madly down the beech avenue with a couple of dogs, her loosened hair streaming behind her like a banner of independence, and had lifted her, hatless and breathless, up before me on my mare, I found that Sarah had saved me the trouble of an explanation. "Mother says you are going to take charge of my education, Stephen," said Betty as soon as she could speak. "I'm glad, because I think that, for an old person, you have a good deal of sense. I suppose my education has to be seen to, some time or other, and I'd rather you'd do it than anybody else I know." "Thank you, Betty," I said gravely. "I hope I shall deserve your good opinion of my sense. I shall expect you to do as I tell you, and be guided by my advice in everything." "Yes, I will," said Betty, "because I'm sure you won't tell me to do anything I'd really hate to do. You won't shut me up in a room and make me sew, will you? Because I won't do it." I assured her I would not. "Nor send me to a boarding school," pursued Betty. "Mother's always threatening to send me to one. I suppose she would have done it before this, only she knew I'd run away. You won't send me to a boarding school, will you, Stephen? Because I won't go." "No," I said obligingly, "I won't. I should never dream of cooping a wild little thing like you up in a boarding school. You'd fret your heart out like a caged skylark." "I know you and I are going to get along together splendidly, Stephen," said Betty, rubbing her brown cheek chummily against my shoulder. "You are so good at understanding. Very few people are. Even Dad, darling, didn't understand. He let me do just as I wanted to, just because I wanted to, not because he really understood that I couldn't be tame and play with dolls. I hate dolls. Real live babies are jolly, but dogs and horses are ever so much nicer than dolls. But you must have lessons, Betty. I shall select your teachers and superintend your studies, and I shall expect you to do me credit along that line, as well as along all others." "I'll try, honest and true, Stephen," declared Betty, and she kept her word. At first I looked upon Betty's education as a duty. In a very short time it became a pleasure, the deepest and most abiding interest of my life. As I had premised, Betty was good material, and responded to my training with gratifying plasticity. Day by day, week by week, month by month, her character and temperament unfolded naturally under my watchful eye. It was like beholding the gradual development of some rare flower in one's garden. A little checking and pruning here, a careful training of shoot and tendril there, and lo, the reward of grace and symmetry. Betty grew up as I would have wished Jack Churchill's girl to grow, spirited and proud, with the fine spirit and gracious pride of pure womanhood, loyal and loving, with the loyalty and love of a frank and unspoiled nature, true to her heart's core, hating falsehood and sham, as crystal clear a mirror of maidenhood as ever man looked into and saw himself reflected back in such a halo as made him ashamed of not being more worthy of it. Betty was kind enough to say that I had taught her everything she knew. But what had she not taught me? If there were a debt between us, it was on my side. Sarah was fairly well satisfied. It was not my fault that Betty was not better looking, she said. I had certainly done everything for her mind and character that could be done. Sarah's manner implied that these unimportant details did not count for much, balanced against the lack of a pink and white skin and dimpled elbows, but she was generous enough not to blame me. "When Betty is 25, I said patiently, I had grown used to speaking patiently to Sarah, "she will be a magnificent woman, far handsomer than you ever were, Sarah, in your pinkest and whitest prime. Where are your eyes, my dear lady, that you can't see the promise of loveliness in Betty?" "Betty is 17, and she is as lanky and brown as she ever was," sighed Sarah. "When I was 17 I was the belle of the county, and had had 5 proposals. I don't believe the thought of a lover has ever entered Betty's head." "I hope not," I said shortly. Somehow I did not like the suggestion. "Betty is a child yet. For pity's sake, Sarah, don't go putting nonsensical ideas into her head." "I'm afraid I can't," mourned Sarah, as if it were something to be regretted. "You have filled it too full of books and things like that. I've every confidence in your judgment, Stephen, and really you've done wonders with Betty. But don't you think you've made her rather too clever? Men don't like women who are too clever. Her poor father, now, he always said that a woman who liked books better than beaux was an unnatural creature." I didn't believe Jack had ever said anything so foolish. Sarah imagined things. But I resented the aspersion of blue-stockingness cast on Betty. "When the time comes for Betty to be interested in beaux," I said severely, "she will probably give them all due attention. Just at present her head is a great deal better filled with books than with silly, premature fancies and sentimentalities. I'm a critical old fellow, but I'm satisfied with Betty, Sarah, perfectly satisfied." Sarah sighed. "Oh, I dare say she is all right, Stephen, and I'm really grateful to you. I'm sure I could have done nothing at all with her. It's not your fault, of course, but I can't help wishing she were a little more like other girls." I galloped away from Glenby in a rage. What a blessing Sarah had not married me in my absurd youth! She would have driven me wild with her size and her obtuseness and her everlasting pink and whiteness. But there, gently. She was a sweet, good-hearted little woman. She had made Jack happy, and she had contrived, heaven only knew how, to bring a rare creature like Betty into the world. For that, much might be forgiven her. By the time I reached the Maples, and had flung myself down in an old, kinky, comfortable chair in my library, I had forgiven her, and was even paying her the compliment of thinking seriously over what she had said. Was Betty really unlike other girls? That is to say, unlike them in any respect wherein she should resemble them? I did not wish this. Although I was a crusty old bachelor, I approved of girls, holding them the sweetest things the good God has made. I wanted Betty to have her full complement of girlhood in all its best and highest manifestation. Was there anything lacking? I observed Betty very closely during the next week or so, riding over to Glenby every day and riding back at night, meditating upon my observations. Eventually I concluded to do what I had never thought myself in the least likely to do. I would send Betty to a boarding school for a year. It was necessary that she should learn how to live with other girls. I went over to Glenby the next day and found Betty under the beeches on the lawn, just back from a canter. She was sitting on the dappled mare I had given her on her last birthday, and was laughing at the antics of her rejoicing dogs around her. I looked at her with much pleasure. It gladdened me to see how much, nay, how totally a child she still was, despite her Churchill height. Her hair, under her velvet cap, still hung over her shoulders in the same thick plaits. Her face had the firm leanness of early youth, but its curves were very fine and delicate. The brown skin that worried Sarah so was flushed through with dusky color from her gallop. Her long, dark eyes were filled with the beautiful unconsciousness of childhood. More than all, the soul in her was still the soul of a child. I found myself wishing that it could always remain so. But I knew it could not. The woman must blossom out some day. It was my duty to see that the flower fulfilled the promise of the bud. When I told Betty that she must go away to a school for a year, she shrugged, frowned, and consented. Betty had learned that she must consent to what I decreed, even when my decrees were opposed to her likings, as she had once fondly believed they never would be. But Betty had acquired confidence in me to the beautiful extent of acquiescing in everything I commanded. "I'll go, of course, since you wish it, Stephen," she said. "But why do you want me to go? You must have a reason. You always have a reason for anything you do. What is it?" "That is for you to find out, Betty," I said. "By the time you come back you will have discovered it, I think. If not, it will have proved itself a good reason, and shall be forgotten." When Betty went away I bade her good-bye without burdening her with any useless words of advice. "Write to me every week, and remember that you are Betty Churchill," I said. Betty was standing on the steps above among her dogs. She came down a step and put her arms about my neck. "I'll remember that you are my friend, and that I must live up to you," she said. "Good-bye, Stephen." She kissed me 2 or 3 times, good hearty smacks. Did not I say she was still a child? And stood waving her hand to me as I rode away. I looked back at the end of the avenue and saw her standing there, short-skirted and hatless, fronting the lowering sun with those fearless eyes of hers. So I looked my last on the child Betty. That was a lonely year. My occupation was gone, and I began to fear that I had outlived my usefulness. Life seemed flat, stale, and unprofitable. Betty's weekly letters were all that lent it any savour. They were spicy and piquant enough. Betty was discovered to have unsuspected talents in the epistolary line. At first she was dolefully homesick, and begged me to let her come home. When I refused, it was amazingly hard to refuse, she sulked through 3 letters, then cheered up and began to enjoy herself. But it was nearly the end of the year when she wrote, "I've found out why you sent me here, Stephen, and I'm glad you did." End of section 21.